Well, the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia are over. This first round, they unsurprisingly did not lead to any agreements. There is no ceasefire, which is unfortunate, but not expected. I always hold out hope when you hear, okay, there's going to be talks, because obviously if they're not talking, there's definitely not going to be a ceasefire. At least if they're talking, there's a chance. But I had heard earlier from the Duran that they had they kind of picked out the guy who Russia was sending to be their negotiator as a pretty hardline guy. So it seemed clear that they're not going to try and cut they're not trying to cut a deal yet. I mean, obviously they'd throw something out there. They'd give the equivalent of what in real estate you'd call a lowball offer. A deal with terms very favorable to Russia, and see, okay, will Ukraine accept our terms? I don't know exactly what the terms were for each side. I saw, reports. I'm not sure how accurate they were of what each side was asking for, or specifically the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians were offering just neutrality, which is a far cry from what they've been saying for the last few years, saying, oh, we're going to join NATO, and then just last week saying, oh, we want nukes. Apparently the Ukrainians went in and said, okay, we'll be a neutral country. Well, Russia, I guess, wanted recognition of, Russian sovereignty over Crimea, and I think recognition of the independence of the Donbass republics, in addition, of course, to the neutrality of Ukraine, which, frankly, if I were in Ukraine's position, if they really made that offer, I would take that. I don't know if they really did, though, or not. That's just what we're hearing. That might be somebody speculating. It's always a game of telephone when there are wars going on and everything's happening very quickly. So I don't want to dwell too much on that, but I'll just say that if I were in Zelensky's position, I'd say, that's a pretty good deal, because Ukraine was never going to get Crimea or the Donbass republics back anyway. That was clear all the way back in 2015. But at this point, they risk losing, a good chunk of the country, like half of it. I think that from what we're seeing, I haven't heard much about the Russians moving to the west. Maybe that's because, they want to conquer in the east first. But I don't know what they would do if they were going to try and conquer all of Ukraine and hold the territory and install some new puppet government. I think it's pretty clear that the westernmost parts of Ukraine will never accept any real association with Russia. They want to be an enemy of Russia. They see themselves as an enemy of Russia. They see Russia as their enemy, and so they're not going to be chummy with them. Whereas in the east, even the Ukrainians in the east are not necessarily people who hate Russia. And so even if they might not choose to be, a part of Russia, and I'm not saying that Russia's going to annex all of eastern Ukraine, like, directly and fly a Russian flag, they might be open to living under a government which has favorable relations with Russia. Because at the end of the day, it's clear Russia just doesn't want they don't want an unfavorable government in Kiev. They want somebody in Kiev who they think of as more their friend than the West's friend. And at the very least, neutral. They don't want an enemy on their border. And so at this point, what seems to make the most sense is they will carve off the eastern part of Ukraine and Kiev. So probably including, other cities like Odessa, which, historically are close to Russia and I guess are majority Russian-speaking. And then leaving a rump state in the west with a capital in the city currently known, I guess, as Lviv or Lviv or Lviv. I don't know how they say it. I'm used to the German pronunciation. I keep saying this every day. Used to the German pronunciation of Lemberg, which is almost extinct at this point. I don't think anybody calls it Lemberg. Maybe the Germans do and the Austrians. But I find that one to be easiest to say, so I'm going to refer to it as Lemberg. They'll probably have a capital there. That seems to be the center of, all the, the hotbed of people who, don't like Russia the most. And as somebody pointed out, I can't remember who, in one of Putin's speeches at the start of this war, when he was trying to give, the Russian narrative justifying or whatever, he pointed out that part of the country was not historically part of the Russian Empire. It was part of, well, I don't think Putin talked about this, but it was part of, Austro-Hungarian Empire and then Poland. And so Putin seemed to have no problem distancing himself and Russia from that part of the country. So it would be odd after that, considering that's his narrative, for him to go against that and try and take it over himself. As for the ruble, it has, has it moved a lot? Has it lost a lot of value? Yes, but it's not been eviscerated. It's not been decimated in literal terms. It's not even been halved. And so while this is, obviously significant, it's not the kind of thing that is going to defeat a country in a time of war. This is the kind of thing that, I think a country when they're going to war, is mentally prepared for, at least the leaders. Now, I can't speak to the average Russian citizen. I don't know how much this will affect them, but that's a part of the political calculus. When you are a leader thinking of going to war, you have to think about how that will impact your citizens and whether your citizens are willing to withstand the costs and bear the costs of that war. And so the Russian government, Putin, who has been in power for over 2 decades, had obviously made the calculus. I think they would have known that this is coming, that the Russian people would be willing to withstand this. And so we shall see, whether Ukraine surrenders first or Putin is overthrown in some kind of coup himself. We're going to know at some point. I think that if the West wanted to try and take down Russia economically in order to force Putin out of power, in order to stop the war, it would have to be something that's done very quickly. Again, we're only 5 days into this, so I don't know if they can continue to put pressure on the ruble and push it further down. Obviously, if the ruble fell as much as it did today, every day for 2 weeks, Russia's probably toast. But if they can't, if this was the big, financial nuke, which I believe that was, I forgot to upload the thumbnail yesterday. I'm gonna have to do that today for yesterday's video. But the thumbnail had said something about nukes and showed a blown up truck, and I think the title was like West nukes Russian ruble. That's what this was supposed to be. Now the results, as of today, are not as bad as I would have imagined. It still, I think, is the worst drop in like 25 years. The worst drop, in the entire time that Putin's been president of Russia. But if you only have to go back to the last president of Russia to find a worse drop in the ruble, I think that might be an indication that the Russian people have seen worse in their lifetimes. And so this kind of a drop will have to be not only sustained, but it will have to continue. It will have to continue to decline day after day, or at least week after week, very quickly, before the Russians are able to win. And at this point, I'm not confident that that's going to happen. I don't think that this plan to try and create hyperinflation in Russia, especially when you consider, everything that they need for the war, is stuff that they produce domestically anyway, and so won't be affected so much by foreign exchange markets. I don't think that this is going to work. The West has tried this in other cases. They tried to doing something similar in Iran and Venezuela. Both of those governments, which are seen as enemies of the United States, still standing after having this the financial kitchen sink thrown at them. Yes, Venezuela has really bad inflation, has hyperinflation, but Maduro has still hung on. Juan Guaido is not the president of Venezuela. I followed that ridiculous saga back in, what was that, 2017? I think it was. I think like my 3rd video on YouTube was about Juan Guaido. So I used to talk about that a lot when that was going on. I think there were 2 failed coups that were supposed to install Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. If they couldn't pull that off in Venezuela, I don't think they're going to be able to pull it off in Russia at this point. So the siege of Kharkov and Kiev continues. I guess Kharkov is seen as more important. I guess maybe there are more troops there. I don't have enough information to say that for certain, but that's kind of what I've been hearing. So maybe what's going on in Kharkov is the main conflict. I heard the Duran suggesting that, but I don't want to rely too heavily on one source. Obviously, they're an aggregator, kind of in the same way that I am, looking all around the internet and such, and their contacts. They have personal contacts. I don't, which is why I'm deferring a little bit to them in Eastern Europe. It's hard to find good information on this. What's easy to find is a lot of happy talk about how well the Ukrainians are doing, which just doesn't seem to quite square with reality. And I don't say that because, I necessarily want, the Russians to do so well. I don't, I said at the beginning, I don't hate either side here. But I would like the war to be over. I don't want this to drag on. If Russia's going to win, which I think seems to be the probable thing in the end, since Russia is bigger and has always been built up, we're always been told Russia is this great, dangerous power, and we have to be so scared of Russia. If Russia's so powerful, then I would think at some point they're going to win this war, and so I would prefer that eventual outcome is associated with as little damage to the country as possible and as few deaths as possible. So, make no mistake, if it sounds like I'm rooting for Russia, I'm just rooting for the war to end. If I thought that there was a realistic chance that, the Ukrainians could push the Russians out, I would be cheering it on and saying, please, end this. But so far, I have to say, I don't think that a lot of us in America might be predisposed to thinking that Russia is doing worse than they are because we are accustomed to shock and awe. That's what we think of as war. We look at Iraq in 2003, and we saw every night, you turn on the evening news, and there's videos of the Americans blowing up buildings in Iraq, tanks exploding, the highway of death. Of course, that was 1991, but we're used to very extremely violent visuals coming out of a war, and that being a sign of victory. Just total annihilation, destruction, leveling cities to the ground, and that's not what Russia's doing. And so people are saying, well, Russia's not, destroyed these cities yet, so that, they interpret that as losing. And from what I understand, what the Russians are trying to do is just encircle the enemy, not blow a bunch of things up, but, kind of, checkmate them. They're playing the game. They're not just trying to annihilate this country because they want to preserve this country. They want to they want it to be an ally of theirs. That's the whole point of this war, from what I understand. Russia, or in some cases annex it. It's not entirely clear, but I think probably they want to set up a puppet regime like the West did in 2014, and so they don't want to destroy Ukraine. They just want to defeat the Ukrainian military, make the present Ukrainian government, realize that, hey, you've lost without actually having to kill a bunch of people or level these cities, and just get them to surrender. You see, another thing that we in America have is a tradition of unconditional surrender. That is, the U.S. Does not negotiate when they're at war. The U.S. or I don't know how accurate. Maybe this isn't totally accurate historically, but what you're taught in school here is that no, in America we don't have conditional surrender. We have we just keep bombing people and killing them, and this is taught like it's a good thing. You kill the enemy until they just put their hands up and they say no, we're totally at your mercy. They have to beg for mercy. What we're told about Japan in World War II is that Hirohito. I guess Tojo had been deposed at this point, but Hirohito said, okay, I'm ready to negotiate. Let's end this war. And Harry Truman said, no negotiations, and then he nuked Hiroshima. And Hirohito came back and said, hey, let's negotiate an end to this war. And Harry Truman said, no, and nuked Nagasaki. And then finally, after that happened twice, Hirohito said, okay, unconditional surrender, I'm at your mercy. Same thing, I believe, with Mexico in the Mexican-American War, marched all the way to Mexico City, took them over, and finally the Mexicans had to say, okay, we're done. You've captured our capital. Take whatever you want. And of course, in every other war, Saddam Hussein in 1991, in particular, wanted to negotiate his surrender in the second Gulf War, what it's called, the 1991 Iraq War. And George H.W. Bush said, no, unconditional surrender. And then Saddam Hussein, he said, okay, I'm running away. I'm going to retreat. And we had the Highway of Death, where the U.S. bombed and, just completely took out the retreating column of the Iraqi army. Whereas Russia, their strategy here is just trying to force the Ukrainians to the negotiating table and extract as many concessions out of them as they can. Now, obviously, these first negotiations came and went, and I guess the Russians were not able to extract as much from the Ukrainians as they would have liked. So what we're going to see is a progression of the Russian advance in Ukraine. If things go well for Russia, they're going to encircle and cut off probably these two major cities and isolate the Ukrainian military, completely, surround them on all sides with Russian soldiers, and to the point to where they can say, hey, there's no way you can win this, so it's time to surrender. Let's negotiate an end to this. And so that's why you can kind of avoid shock and awe. You don't have to do shock and awe because you're actually giving the enemy a chance to surrender. You look at, Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi, the Americans just wanted them dead, and so no way they could surrender. If they surrendered, they would have been killed, and of course they didn't surrender, and they said, okay, well, I'm at least going to try and fight for my life, and they were both killed anyway. I sincerely hope that fate does not befall Zelensky and any of these other, Ukrainian guys. I don't like to see people killed, even if, let's say they are, corrupt war criminals or something like that. Well, actually, war criminals I do like to see killed, because I do think that the death penalty should exist for certain people, maybe. Although I'm fairly conservative with a small c when it comes to the death penalty. I don't like, meting it out to everybody. I do think that is playing God to a certain extent. But it's hard for me to argue against it, when you're talking about people who orchestrate, serious mass murder campaigns, which is what wars are. So I imagine there will be some people maybe who want to troll me in the comments who say, well, why aren't you calling for Putin to be, tried for war crimes and hung? And it's like, well, that only happens when you lose a war. Look at Milosevic. That's, he lost. NATO defeated him in 1999, so they tried him for war crimes, and it's not. I don't want to get into necessarily how he died. I don't entirely understand how he died, but if Putin wins this war, which seems to be the case, he's not going to be tried for war crimes. That's just the way that the world works. Neither is George W. Bush. George W. Bush is going to spend the rest of his life at peace on his ranch in Texas. Dick Cheney will be off in Wyoming, doing whatever it is you do in Wyoming. Barack Obama will enjoy, living his life as a celebrity on Martha's Vineyard, and the list goes on. Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, all these people who have done terrible things, and yes, Vladimir Putin included, they will not be punished for those crimes against humanity. So I think we're starting to settle into this war. I don't think there will be a ton of new news, so maybe tomorrow I can talk about something else. Not that I want to ignore the war, but I don't know if there will be a lot of daily, developments. I think that things are starting to slow down, and so it'll just be a waiting game on the encirclement of Kharkov and Kiev, and see if those cities eventually surrender. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.